Welcome back today for this last lecture in this series. I hope I can throw some more light on some positive features in the environment as we look at reading in the South African cognitive catastrophe. So this is it's not coming through. Let's try testing. That better. That better. Nothing coming through there. Okay. HDMI is on. It was working earlier.
Oh, you know what? Where is your this thing on? Is it Bluetooth?
Hmm?
Is this Bluetooth?
It's it's Bluetooth. Yeah. Just. There it is.
Okay, perfect. Go there. Normally, yeah.
Got it. Great. Right. What can be done about it? What can be done about addressing this reading catastrophe? And I mentioned reading coalitions to PrimTEd, PrimTEd being the primary teacher education project of the Department of Higher Education and Training. What are these positive initiatives that can help deal with the problem? There are, in fact, quite a range of them. There are NGOs, there are government departments, etc. One of the earliest was Maltino, Institute for Language and Literacy, who are still producing materials. Xenex Foundation, which produces materials. National Education Collaboration Trust, which is running some big district school-based interventions. There's Nali Bali, who many of you will know about, popularizing reading in communities and schools, and they have a radio program. There's the Higher Education and Training Department. There's PrimTEd, which I've mentioned. There's Funda Wande, which is a well-funded attempt to produce really good video-based and coursework-based materials in isiXhosa. And more recently, the National Reading Coalition, and I'll look at all of these. Let's go to the Department of Basic Education. It has tried. It does have programs every now and then. Whether they have had much impact is another matter, partly because I think there are high levels of incompetence in many of the officials in Pretoria. But there was Masifunda Sonke, Reading for All, 2001, which sort of sputtered along, and then the Read to Lead campaign, which ended last year. Most recently, and probably of most significance, is the Department of Basic Education have developed a national framework for the teaching of reading in African languages in the foundation phase. And this, I think, will have significant impact, because it's really looking at the African languages, what is different about each language as it comes to the teaching of reading and writing. And that, it's sort of in a draft form. It'll probably be in its final form probably within a couple of months. Then my own background is adult education. The Department of Education, as it then was, then basic education, did make some impact on adult illiteracy, albeit at a very basic level. In 2001 was the South African National Literacy Initiative. Started off with great fanfare. Kader Asmal, then Minister of Education, they were going to break the back of illiteracy within a couple of years. It was essentially totally subverted by recalcitrant officials in the Department of Education, who, for various reasons of their own, didn't want it to happen. Then, in 2006, the then Minister of Education, Naledi Pandor, sent a team off to Cuba and Venezuela to learn how to do literacy. Because, as we all know, Cuba had eradicated illiteracy after the Cuban Revolution, and they did it in a year by closing down the school system for a year. And they sent the children out into the highways and byways to teach their parents and older brothers and siblings how to read and write. And it worked. And Cuba has a very impressive education system and very impressive teacher training. Unfortunately, the particular method they were now espousing, which had no links to the Fidel Castro one of the 1960s, was crazy. And the group that went to Cuba didn't like it. They thought the way the campaign was organized in Venezuela, for example, was extremely impressive, but we would develop our own materials and so forth. And so in 2008, the Kari Khudi Let Us Learn literacy campaign started. It reached about 600,000 people a year who were meant to be illiterate, totally illiterate, although in fact quite a few people had had a smattering of schooling. And it delivered a quite effective program, as I say, of absolutely basic literacy. What was significant about it, when one gets over the various corrupt officials in the department who often hindered the setting up of the program, was it was able to get 40,000 volunteer teachers who received a small stipend all over the country, often unemployed people who had a senior certificate but who couldn't get into university. And it delivered workbooks, primers, literally to every literacy group in the country. And it can be achieved. It does show that if you plan properly, if you have a good plan, if you have the will, you can achieve something very dramatic. They had the workbooks, and they had national assessment. In that picture there, you can see a huge hall which is full of assessment portfolios, a little book full of exercises which people did during the course. They were all collected together, taken to Pretoria, and moderated. Extremely impressive. The biggest assessment moderation exercise this country has ever seen. So things can be done. And this is a literacy campaign which is hardly received any publicity. Most people don't know about it. I think the West, because you're many from the Western Cape, the Western Cape had a relatively small component of the program, given that this was run by an African National Congress-dominated government. I don't think they were particularly interested in the Western Cape because of political reasons, but there was a small presence in the Western Cape. But in other provinces, particularly Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, and other provinces, very impressive gains. Tragedy, it was meant to get people through this basic literacy And then they would go to the public adult learning centers, the state-run night schools. That didn't happen because that system was badly managed. And the directorate in Pretoria was totally incompetent. But it does show, with good planning, with good materials, you can achieve something very impressive. It went on until about 2016-17 when it finished, and it had reached about 4 million people. The Department of Basic Education also developed workbooks and readers and big books. Many people simply don't know that these exist, but in theory, every school should have a full range of language and literacy workbooks, grades R to grade 6. And I think they're pretty useful. I think they're well designed. They are there. And then there are 10 readers for each grade in grades 1 to 3. Beautiful little readers for children. The material is there. It's all accessible for download from the website. And the big books, which a teacher can hold up, show the class, and they've got 8 big books for each language. So, no, all the languages. All South African languages, yeah. All of these materials are in all languages. And they weren't translated, they were versioned, so that it does take into account many of the differences between the languages and the way you approach this. 11 languages, yeah. Then we see various departments starting to do things at the district level. Gauteng has a primary literacy strategy. It's been ran for 5 years. First of all learners in grades 3 and 6 were tested using the early grade reading assessment. Not quite as sophisticated as that PEARLS international thing, but it's also an international test, which looks, can you read a few words? Can you read a simple passage and ask questions on it? Can you read reasonably fluently at a reasonable speed? And they provide curriculum outlines and training on them. They give instruction on the use of the DBE workbooks, because many schools have these workbooks but don't use them. They're sitting in the headmaster's cupboard, because books are valuable, so we don't want them to get dirty and used by children. Although in theory, every child should have their workbook and be able to take it home and keep it at the end of the year. And they have a literacy resource package, teacher guides, and training on them. Then there are a number of public-private partnerships by government departments with NGOs and universities. Some of them relate to school district development. The National Education Collaboration Trust, which was set up a few years ago, got some big business funding and is working in particular school districts to try and get reading improved. Pearson Morang Education Trust, also working in the field, and another one called PILO, a program to improve learning outcomes. Again, generally these approaches say we go into a district, we have materials, we have coaching, we have people to guide the teachers. And then a lot of stuff on teacher development, or in-service teacher development. The early grade reading study, which was done largely in Gauteng, Limpopo, and Mpumalanga, and which informed the Gauteng initiative. There's a scholar, Bram Fleisch, who's actually written a book. He had the triple cocktail. And he argues that given the mess, you need a triple cocktail. Lesson plans, scripted lesson plans for each teacher. You need coaching by a reasonably well-qualified people who can help those teachers in a particular area, and materials. And this is taking place in English in Mpumalanga and in Setswana in Northwest Province. And the results are looking quite pleasing. Funda Wande, I've mentioned, is producing really interesting video and materials courses. Again, they've got a website, and you can download a lot of this stuff. It's going to be open source. So any organization, any university can use those materials and incorporate them into their own. And I think what is particularly valuable, they have these videos showing people doing the actual literacy instruction. So a teacher can see how to do it effectively. And a range of other ones I've mentioned, like the Xenex Foundation have produced course materials. Maltina Institute also producing course materials and readers. Read, many are familiar with, who've been striving for decades to get books into schools. Elit and Utini. So there's something going on in teacher development in the schools. Then, just to go back to that, I mentioned that triple cocktail. They intensively looked at 50 schools. They were tracked over 3 years, and they used 3 different models. One was a parental support intervention. You help the parents, help the child with homework, read to the children. Then there was a centralized training model. You send the teachers off to some center to be trained on these new methods, or you have that triple cocktail thing of lesson plans, resources, and coaching. And all of them had an effect. All of them did some good, but the triple cocktail resulted in learners being 4 to 5 months ahead of their corresponding children in the control schools. And it is being taken up by the Department of Basic Education and may well be started on a more national scale. Funda Wande I've mentioned. It's got a range of materials, videos, and it is now working with Rhodes University to start a course for the training of teachers in the Funda Wande kind of use of their materials, of their materials, and that is being piloted this year. The person who started Funda Wande is a well-known Stellenbosch researcher who often writes about literacy and pearls, that is Nick Spall. Something about other public-private partnerships with NGOs and universities is simply in materials and resources. African Storybook Project, started by the South African Institute of Distance Education. They have got an absolutely magnificent set of stories in virtually every language in Africa. And they're lovely. They're well understood. They can be downloaded onto a smartphone or onto a computer. And they, again, they're free. You can download them and print them. So there is when one's talking about parents not reading to their children, if they do have a smartphone, they can download 10, 15 stories in one of the South African languages. Literacy Boost, Centre for the Book, Biblioneef, Room to Read, all of these are similar things, producing useful materials. I'm involved in another initiative new readers publishers, but they produce materials for adult new readers. And that's on a website, and that's also freely downloadable. And then there are organizations which teach learners. They get involved, whether in schools or in outside schools. Shine is a well-known one, I think, based in Cape Town. Link, Help to Read, Peduka, Spell It, Learn Ready Literacy, Living Language Foundation, Funza. So all of those are out there, and some of them produce really useful reading materials. I think I'd say most of these organizations are particularly good at the support of reading once the child can sort of read. And so they're there. And many of them are free. In some cases, you have to pay. And then there are the more community-based Nali Bali, which has gained serious traction through its publicity, becoming a bigger organization. And I think they're doing really excellent work. And WordWorks is another, I think, Cape Town-based organization working largely at the community level. One has to mention some problems, caveats about many of these problems, particularly with the NGOs. As you know, after 1994, when foreign governments no longer funded directly to the NGO anti-apartheid sector, they suffer from lack of consistent funding, particularly for what one could call basal funding or institutional funding. A foreign funder will often fund a project 3 years, because they work in these 3-year cycles. But after that, it all falls to pieces. And the follow-up.
I think after the Zuma-Gupta effect, there's been a huge drop in funding from overseas. There's been years of funding from overseas.
Right. Because of the fear of corruption. Mm. And of course, one has to be very honest, sometimes projects where money did come through government departments, basic education and others, there were elements of corruption, often in terms of printing tenders and that sort of thing. So I have personal knowledge of one official getting a 5 million rand bribe related to printing. That's serious money. Most focus on English. And many of them, although they are really excellent in what they do, they don't address the lack of foundational whole language reading competence. And that is a problem. Again, it's a question of this transition to English not being handled adequately. But in terms of what they deliver, they're very good as support for reading in English. And many of them use methods which I think are a little bit outdated. But they're doing good work. They really are doing good, excellent work, often by people like yourselves, who are available to provide resources and initiative in this field. And then there's the Primary Teacher Education Project. The Department of Higher Education and Training, which of course handles universities and teacher training, came to the conclusion, and I think accurately, and going back to my first lecture, I said, we have a problem. Can one change the learners? No. Can one change the parents? No. Can one change the teachers? With some difficulty. But you can try and train your reading and writing teachers better. And so they set up this project 4 years ago to try and influence the universities to do things better in terms of teaching reading and writing, and taking it much more seriously. And there is a website which has got a range of resources which have been either used by the project or have been generated by them. I need to say that I am currently working for PrimTEd, so I have a vested interest in it. It's a collaborative initiative between all South African universities, meant to improve initial teacher education. It focuses on language literacy and mathematics. It got 20 million rand from the European Union for a 4-year project, ending a couple of months' time. And there are 7 working groups: literacy, 3 maths groups, assessment, work integrated learning, you may prefer to call it teaching practice, and knowledge management. Its rationale was what we've been looking at: poor learner performance, teachers' own lack of knowledge, and you've got to get literacy and maths right. That there were huge variations between the programs at the various universities. We did an audit of this. In fact, 2 audits, one specific on more generally, and one simply looking at those universities which were training teachers who were going to teach in isiZulu or Sesotho. Huge range of different courses. Some hardly taught anything about reading and writing. Some did. But the topics were very idiosyncratic, seemingly based probably on some past lectures, particular research interest. And so the PrimTEd argued that there was a need to focus on recurriculating, reforming the initial teacher education programs in order to improve their quality, the content depth and breadth of what they were doing, and the practice theory balance. Because it was very clear that, particularly in relation to reading and writing, the teaching of, that in many cases there seemed to be an assumption that, well, we can't really deal with that at university. You'll have to learn that in the classroom from the older teachers who've already been doing it. I was involved with the literacy working group, developing a new teacher graduate's ability to teach English first additional language and African languages with a special focus on reading. And we had specific aims and objectives there. Firstly, developing the students' own language and literacy practices and proficiency. The reality that many students, education students, do not read. They don't read for pleasure. They don't read books or magazines. They very seldom engage as committed readers. And to then influence particularly the foundation, intermediate phase, the curricula, the courses, the materials, and the assessment tools in line with core standards. And again, with the African languages, trying to find out how African languages can best be taught when you're teaching reading and writing, given that, again, in most of these universities, the language of instruction is English, and the assumption is that you teach how to teach literacy in English, somehow the student can carry it over. If it's a important one.
You emphasize a lot of reading, but have you ever, or I'm not sure which one to do, but I'm talking about outcomes, more education institutions, the importance of a library.
Yeah.
Because if a child reads and comes across a new word, you don't understand it when it comes to the class. The reason why we use the word school all the time in high school is because it's going to the class. You must have the first black female vice chancellor of this institution. Before she became vice chancellor, Dr. She was a PhD.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Sorry? Firstly, basically the importance of libraries in vocabulary development, in reading, and secondly, the fact that the teaching of English by teachers who themselves are not really fluent in English itself is a very problem. Is that a fair summary?
And the kids, when they come across a new word, if they don't understand that word, it becomes a mental block. They tend to continue with the sentence. Because the importance of the dictionary is not being emphasized strongly.
Yeah. So PrimTEd has been exploring, it's been looking at research into the teaching of African languages, also how the African languages can be further developed to match literacy expectations at the higher grade levels, and building interest and scholarship in the teaching and learning of African languages and literacy. And so what PrimTEd had to deliver was standards, knowledge and practice standards for reading and writing teachers, a curriculum framework, a suggestion on what should go into initial teacher education training, what the components are, materials to support this, and assessment tools to assess student teachers' competence to teach reading and writing, and of course maths in that field. And the standards have been developed. They've been through 6 editions. They've been consulted on over the last couple of years, and it is very likely that the final version will be gazetted in a government gazette and basically recommended to universities, because obviously the Department of Higher Education and Training recognizes that universities have academic freedom. They don't have to follow these prescriptions, but they're encouraged to do so. And I'm just going to quickly take you, just to indicate what is in these standards, and they're all on the PrimTEd website. This is an anchor statement, like in here: graduate teachers have knowledge of language and literacy and how to teach learners to read and write. There's the purpose of the set of standards. There are general competencies assumed to be in place in a teacher. There are level descriptors. These are SACWA levels of, and then how they relate to the professional teaching standards endorsed by the South African Council for Educators. And then the actual standard, like, for example, this first standard is demonstrate basic knowledge of the key components of language. If you're going to be a literacy teacher, you should at least know, at a very primitive, simple level, what is language, what is it made up of? And then evidence of achievement. What would be a way of testing that a person knew something about language? And the suggestion was that a teacher should be able to say something about phonology, the sounds, the morphology, the shape of words and stuff, grammar, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, which is about appropriate use of language in particular situations. That you should know, as I said, we're not talking about rocket science here or a major in linguistics. This is simply, you should know something about language, and that would be an example of a standard with the evidence. And then the other check, you should have some basic comparative knowledge of the similarities and differences in the components across the South African languages. So let's take a teacher in an X-Model C school, which is made up, it may well be in English, that, the medium of instruction, but half the class are mother tongue isiXhosa. You need to know something about the structure of that language if you're going to be able to adequately help those children in adapting to an English language teaching environment. And so all these standards, and for example, the third one there, 12 demonstrate vocabulary and word study knowledge, and there are a whole lot of ways you would check the evidence of that. So these provide a kind of guideline to universities to ensure that are their courses, modules, whatever they call them, are they actually delivering competent teachers who know these things? We believe a teacher of reading and writing should know these things. There's a draft curriculum framework, and these are the key components the PrimTEd Literacy Working Group thought every university should deal with in relation to literacy. How do children learn to read and write? Something about decoding, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, writing, motivation and response in reading, obviously important. Text for children. Many universities will teach a course on children's literature, but it's in English, dealing with English books, although the majority of teachers being trained in that class are not going to be in the foundation phase or teaching in another language. And working with the school literacy curriculum, if you are using CAPS, you've got to know how to use it. Assessment and remediation, planning, literacy and literacies, more about the sociology of literacy, and all these new forms of digital literacy, visual literacy, and so forth, which also, particularly at advanced level, are important parts of learning to read and write. And then, of course, teaching English as a first additional language and teaching the African language to Afrikaans as a first additional language. So those, we thought, whatever universities are doing about literacy, they really should have something on all of those components, whether it's a short course or multiple courses, is a matter for them to decide. Then, last but not least, on the 15th of February this year, the National Reading Coalition was set up. It's got big business backing and, of course, the backing of government departments, higher education and basic education. And it is, in theory, going to try and coordinate a whole lot of initiatives to make reading a big thing. And of course, you may recall that the State of the Nation speech by the president, state president, mentioned reading, said we've got to deal with this problem. So there we have a national initiative which is trying to get things going. Will it work? We don't know. It's early days. You know, a lot of these big initiatives start with a huge jamboree in Gauteng somewhere. People flying from all over the country. There's a bit of publicity, but then it kind of fades away, and it's another office or suite of offices in some big building in Midrand where things happen, but it doesn't make a big impact. Because, as with all these things, one is dealing with, in the school system, a whole lot of problematic behaviors, and we know that. I also want to round off by JET, Joint Education Trust Education Services, is a well-known education NGO. They put out, I think it was in December, a very useful document looking at consolidating research and comparing practice in South Africa in relation to the teaching of reading and writing. It's a really useful condensed summary of research and practice, and that is also downloadable. They make a number of recommendations which I think are worth looking at. They're suggesting developing a synthetic phonics approach for African languages. They want more research into African language literacy, linked to teaching practice, more resources for home and English language teaching, more focus on the preliminary to schooling, early childhood development. If one can get that right, it gives children who come from particularly a deprived background a better chance, and much more effort to bridge the transition between grade 3 and grade 4. And not least, to ensure that in the home languages, advanced literacy practices are taught in the higher grades. And it also recommends that intervention should work with both teachers and learners. And that essentially brings me to the end of this series. I believe it's imperative that this cycle of inadequate teaching, inadequate learning is broken, and that it should be done fast. It is an emergency, it is a crisis, it needs to be dealt with. It can be done. I gave the example of the Karihudi campaign, which reached out to 600,000 adult illiterates, hard to get in touch with, but it managed to get in touch with them and provided resources. It can be done. Just a couple of points. Thank you for your interest. Anybody who wants to communicate with me, that's my email address, and I do respond. And last but not least, just a little fun advert. This is really great fun for those who are interested in, early. I think you have to pay for it, but you can get it on your smartphone or a computer. It was developed in Finland, and it basically has European languages, but it's really very good. And there's backup material. And some people have asked me for information on, this whole difficulty of the teaching of English in grade 4. Look, there's very little material on that transition. It's got to be developed. But there's a lot of really good material on the teaching of English. And the United Kingdom has a really brilliant manual called Letters and Sounds, which is freely downloadable. Okay, I'm going to end there. Any questions? Which one? The... And these slides are going to be available, some of them already are, on the summer school website for the page related to this lecture series. Yes. Yeah.
That was in terms of that report that you said.
The Pearl's 2016 study, yeah.
And the world average is 4%.
Yeah.
Where do we rank in Africa?
Not great. We're near the bottom. Countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Swaziland's better than us, which sounds odd because they're a really poor country. They do better. We're very low.
Can I add something there? I think what is shocking is that we spend far more money
We do.
than some countries like Uganda, etc. Yet their literacy is better. So we're spending it wrongly, we're doing it wrongly.
There's something that bothers me. I work at a teaching college, training institution, and a practical problem that we've encountered when we were discussing teaching pre-service teachers was, in a university course, all teachers are required to take 2 languages. One as a home language, one as a first additional language, much as the same as children in schools. But there's a kind of complexity surrounding what children select as their home language when they enter university. For example, you may have grown up in the Eastern Cape and speak East Xhosa as a home language with your family, but the majority of your school education would have taken predominantly place in English. So then when you get to university and you're asked to select a home language, you would, in theory, be qualified to teach foundation-based children in East Xhosa.
Yes.
But because most of your schooling's in English, you tend to select English as a home language.
Yeah.
And then you think to yourself, well, I'm liable to get better marks in East Xhosa as a first additional language because it'll be easier than a home language. And so there's something about how our school system and our university is set up that it doesn't encourage people to take their home language as a home language. And so nobody ever actually becomes qualified. And I don't know how to deal with that.
We don't know how to deal with it. It's a real problem because there's this benign neglect in the school system of the home languages in the higher grades. There's a kind of assumption, well, it's their home language, they'll be able to muddle through, even though they're writing their home language probably from a trick in whatever that home language is, and English as a second language. It has to be addressed, and the all political pressures. There's no argument that there should be 3. You should know 3 languages, and it's kind of politically correct pressure, and one understands the reason for that politically correct pressure, but it's not helping at the level of, as I say, of the engagement at university. What are you doing? This has to be discussed and analysed